we're going to label as 0. Then we've got this partial repolarization phase, which is shown here with the arrow. We're going to label that as phase 1. There's this plateau where the membrane potential seems to be rather constant. We're going to label that as phase 2. And then we're going to label this next phase simply as phase 3. This is repolarization. And then we've got our resting membrane potential, which we'll label as phase 4. Now here's an important point, and that is, if we're looking at the action potential of a neuron, what was the typical duration of the action potential produced by a neuron? An antibody. And Stephanie. Well, honestly, that's an appreciated answer. The answer is about 2 to 3 milliseconds. Notice in this action potential, the duration is about 100 times longer. The duration is not 2 to 3 milliseconds. Instead, the duration is about 350 milliseconds. And in large part, that's due to this plateau phase. So we're talking just about the ventricles. We're focused just on the ventricles. So here I'm going to put Q, R, S. Then we'll have ST segment. That's followed by the T wave, which is followed by the resting membrane potential. So this is somewhat like a chart that we began to develop before. And you'll remember here, I believe I had ion flux. We're going to change that. We're going to move that over a couple columns. So we're going to replace that, and we're going to put electrophysiology, and for the QRS complex, we're going to say that this corresponds to depolarization, just as we had before, except we're going to provide a little bit more detail. We've got the T wave, which is this repolarization event. And then we've got our resting membrane potential. Here we're going to put membrane protein. And I'm hoping that all of you will tell me that this phase 0, that's due to the opening of voltage-gated sodium ion channels. And I would hope that with respect to the T wave, when you see that that's repolarization, that you would tell me that that's due to the opening of voltage-gated, what? Opening of voltage-gated there we go. The opening of voltage-gated potassium ion channels. And then we've got the resting membrane potential. And hopefully you would say that that resting membrane potential is due to these leaky potassium ion channels. Okay, now let's go back and fill in a couple of the blanks here. So we've got this ST segment. That ST segment, we've got this plateau phase where the membrane potential is not changing. But all of you have been given a heads up on this. And during this particular phase of the action potential, there are voltage-gated potassium ion channels that are open, and at the same time there are voltage-gated calcium ion channels that are open. And if you sit there and think about the movement of ions, if we've got these voltage-gated potassium ion channels that are open, I'm hoping all of you would tell me that the electrochemical gradient favors the efflux of potassium out of the cell. How do we know that? Because the chemical gradient for potassium favors the efflux. Here, the membrane potential is about plus 30 to 40 millivolts. So the inside of the cell has got a positive charge on it. The potassium ion has a positive charge on it. We've got these simple rules that we can use that say that that like charges repel one another, opposite charges attract. So we've got positive charge inside the cell, positive charge on potassium, so there's an electrical gradient that also favors the efflux of potassium. And if we add these two forces together, there's a fairly significant electrochemical gradient that favors the efflux of potassium. That wants to make the inside of the cell what? If we've got this positive charge leaving the cell, then hopefully you would tell me that the inside of that cell, its charge, its membrane potential will become more positive or more negative?
Negative.
More negative, right? If we're losing positive charge, the inside of that cell will become more negative. Now, simultaneously, while all this is happening, there are these voltage-gated calcium ion channels that also open. And if you go through the same exercise I just went through, except for calcium, all of you should tell me that there's a very strong chemical gradient that favors the movement of calcium into the cell. So here I'm going to put delta C subscript calcium. Anybody remember, what is an equilibrium potential? Ooh, that hurts, huh? Miss Daria, what's the equilibrium potential? You gotta speak up louder because we can't hear you.
Should be -1.
Now, what is the definition of the equilibrium potential?
Membrane potential that produces an electrical gradient that is represented by the opposite to the chemical gradient.
Yep, very good. That's right. She said that an equilibrium potential is a membrane potential that produces an electrical gradient that's exactly equal to but opposite the chemical gradient. And Astaria, what is the equilibrium potential for calcium?
I remember -120 millivolts.
Minus 120 millivolts? I don't know, that sounds good, doesn't it?
120 positive.
I don't know. Maybe you guys should get your calculators out and calculate it. I'll give you 2 minutes.
Equilibrium potential calcium. Oh, okay. Who's this? What is it?
Miss Natalie Long. Can you come up and show us what the Nernst equation is while everybody is visually calculating their equilibrium? Are you there yet?
Try to find it.
Maybe Miss Guadalupe can come up and help you out. Huh? You're looking for it. Here, let me help you. You'll be there turning your pages all night long.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Mr. Swanson. Yep, just a Nernst equation. Good job. Good. Thank you. Okay, so all of you have learned this in the past, and I'm shocked that you guys would forget this equation. Shocked. I'm absolutely floored that you guys can't remember this equation. So let's do the math. We have a concentration of calcium outside the cell of about 140 millimolar. And what, did I say something wrong? Okay, what a reaction. Okay, so the concentration of calcium outside the cell is 4 millimolar, right? Nope. It's 1 millimolar. And the concentration inside the cell is 4 millimolar, right? Concentration inside the cell is 0.1 micromolar. So we've got 1 divided by 0.1, which is 10. Take the log of 10, which is 1, times 60 millivolts. And so the answer is 60 millivolts. Right, Ms. Moore? Did I do that right? No? How about 1 millimolar divided by 0.1 micromolar is a 10,000-fold concentration gradient. The log of 10,000 is quattro, and 4 times 60 millivolts is 240 millivolts. So the equilibrium potential is 240 millivolts for calcium, right? So got to take into account the charge of the ion, which is 2. So we've got 240 millivolts divided by 2, which is 120 millivolts. The cell is not at 120 millivolts. Yes, it's positive, but it's about 30 to 40 millivolts. So is the charge inside the cell strong enough to oppose, completely null out the chemical gradient? The answer is no, it's not. So there is an electrical gradient that favors the efflux of calcium out of the cell. However, it's much smaller than the chemical gradient. So there's this net influx of calcium into the cell. So we've got, if you're not getting the memo, we've got positive charge leaving the cell in the form of potassium, and at the same time we've got positive charge entering the cell in the form of calcium. And those two cancel each other out such that it creates this plateau phase. So here, where we've got the ST segment, I'm going to write plateau. And you're going to tell me that that plateau phase is due to the efflux of potassium and the simultaneous influx of calcium into the cell. So we've got ion flux. We've got our opening of the voltage gauge sodium ion channel, so you would all tell me that's the influx of sodium. We get to our plateau phase. That's due to the efflux of potassium ions and simultaneously the influx of calcium ions. Voltage gated calcium ion channels closed. We have these voltage gated potassium ion channels are open. So we've got this continuing efflux of potassium ions that gives rise to phase 3, the repolarization. And then eventually these voltage-gated potassium ion channels close, and at that point we're left with our leaky potassium ion channels that continue to allow a reduced efflux of potassium ions. Phase 1. Phase 1 we're going to refer to as partial repolarization. Mr. Swanson, what would you say is due to that partial repolarization?
Okay, it would be the sodium going into the cell,
The sodium going into the cell?
entering the influx of sodium.
Okay, all right. Hello, Smiley. Ms. McKenty, what's your answer? What's responsible for that partial repolarization? The influx of potassium comes up. Very good. So during this partial repolarization, we've got these voltage-gated potassium ion channels that are opening or have opened. So it's kind of simple, actually, if you sit there and think about the electrophysiology that you've learned. When we talk about depolarization, that's a sodium event, right? I haven't told you anything different than that. When we talk about repolarization, you would tell me that's a potassium event. That would give me information to tell you otherwise. Here, the EKG, the only thing that's really different is we've got this plateau phase. So you just have to appreciate that during that plateau phase, we've got a positive charge leaving the cell, which wants to make inside the cell less positive or negative. But simultaneously, we have a positive charge coming into the cell in the form of calcium that cancels out that effect. Now, one of the points that I've made to you in lab, to both groups in lab, is that this part of the EKG is very sensitive to blood flow to the heart. And in case I haven't made it clear to you, what we're showing is here's our EKG trace, and here's the temporal alignment. We're aligning this EKG with the action potential being produced by the ventricular cardiac myocyte, so that we can see what are the cellular events that correspond to the different parts of the EKG. And when you do this, what happens is you learn that the ST segment corresponds to the plateau phase. And this is the point that I made to you in lab, and that is the beauty of the EKG is the EKG reflects millions of these events occurring. The EKG, the shape, reflects the movement of ions. That's what you have to appreciate, is that the shape of that action potential is dependent upon the movement of ions. And if the cell is healthy, if it's able to get enough oxygen and produce enough ATP to satisfy the energetic demands of the cell, then the movement of ions will occur normally, and this ST segment will be right along the isoelectric baseline. On the other hand, if we have ventricular cardiac myocytes that are not receiving adequate amounts of oxygen, then they're not able to produce enough ATP to keep up with the demands of the cell. And now the movement of ions will become abnormal. The cell's not able to properly maintain its intracellular environment, to maintain all the energetic demands of the cell, and as a result, the movement of ions becomes disturbed. But the ion with the greatest concentration gradient is calcium. Calcium. So where is calcium in our EKG? It's the ST segment. So in instances of ischemia, what is that? Ms. Lepard, ischemia is what? What's the definition of that?
Holding back blood, like,
So holding,
supply of oxygen and blood from a...
So ischemia, what's the definition of ischemia? This is really important for all you know going forward. It's reduced blood flow, right? That's what it is. And by definition, you just work logically. If you have reduced blood flow, then the delivery of oxygen is reduced. And the ability of the cell to produce ATP will be reduced. And now that cell is potentially at risk. In cases of cardiac ischemia or myocardial ischemia, here's what happens with the ST segment. You get what is referred to as ST segment depression. So here I'm just going to write ST segment depression, and I'm going to put equals myocardial ischemia. Now, without stating the rest of what I just said, myocardial ischemia means that we have myocardial hypoxia. And now I'm not going to write the rest of it, but you're all going to appreciate that if we've got hypoxia, we have a decreased delivery of oxygen, which means that the cells may not be able to produce as much ATP as they need to, and eventually this myocardial hypoxia can lead to a myocardial infarction. And that myocardial infarction is where we've got cells that now are dying or have died. So ST segment depression equals myocardial ischemia. You put somebody on a treadmill, you have them do some type of exercise stress test. During that stress test, you're monitoring the EKG. And one of the things you're looking for, one of the things, not the only thing, is the depression of that ST segment. If they have depression of that ST segment, then that's a positive test, meaning that they have a abnormal EKG, and you would suspect that that really is due to myocardial ischemia. You can also have another variation of the ST segment. And rather than having ST segment depression, you can have ST segment elevation. And this can be indicative, not always, but can be indicative of a myocardial infarction. Or a different way of saying it, a heart attack. Questions about that? Don't be bashful, speak up. Ms. Nima, does it sound reasonable if you're creating the final, does it sound reasonable that you would ask your students to be able to calculate the equilibrium potential?
Yes.
Okay, just checking with you. Yeah.
Partial visualization happens in
Yes, it does. Okay, now I want to talk about the Fick Principle. Miss Miriam,
Yeah.
what is a normal stroke volume? Forgot. Right. Here's what I need you guys to do. I want you to look through your notes, and I want you to tell me what the formula is to calculate cardiac output, and based upon that, what would you calculate a normal cardiac output to be? Give you guys 3 minutes. Go, go, go. So the question is, what's the formula to calculate cardiac output, followed by what is a normal value for cardiac output?
Yeah, that's all consistent.
Yeah. Yeah, you do.
Yeah.
I Googled it and it says 4 to 8 liters per minute.
We're not getting after it.
I know. What did you come up with? 2,400 milliliters per minute? It's a volume, so it has to be in milliliters, right? It has to be what he wants. Didn't he ask if he wanted to know what stroke volume was? Didn't he? But cardiac output is just Q equals HR times SV, right? So what's the average heart rate then? 60?
Average heart rate 60 to 100 minus usually around resting. So it's 60.
And then what did you calculate the SV?
Okay, let's see here, Miss Mai. Oh, Miss Mai. What is the formula for cardiac output? Question is, what is the formula for cardiac output? I gave you several formulas? Really? For cardiac output? Well, where are they? What was the other formula? What's that? There's only one? Okay. So how about under gas transport? We come along and we write that cardiac output is equal to heart rate times stroke volume. Ms. Lepard, what's a normal heart rate?
Like 60 to 100.
60 to 100?
Pretty few.
Okay, all right. So say the cardiac output is equal to heart rate times stroke volume. And Kristen says that the normal heart rate is somewhere between 60 to 100 beats per minute, which is a normal accepted range. We'll come along, we'll say that it's 70 beats a minute, just to pull a number out of the hat. So I'm going to put 70 beats per minute. What I need all of you to appreciate is that when we talk about a heartbeat, you should understand we're really talking about a single cardiac cycle. So how many times a minute does your heart go through cardiac cycle? The answer is 70 times. And what's the normal stroke volume? Miss Wu, Julia Wu. And you got that because you take the systolic blood pressure minus the diastolic blood pressure, right? So we got 120 minus 80. Is that correct? Okay. All right. Anybody else have an idea on that? Normal stroke volume would be 120 minus 80. In women, it would be 110 minus 70. Right? That would be 110 millimeters of mercury minus 70 millimeters of mercury. So a normal stroke volume would be right around 40 millimeters of mercury. Right? You agree with that, don't you? Don't think so. What's a normal value for end systolic volume? It's 50 milliliters, that's right. And what's the normal value for end diastolic volume? 120. And that's actually in units of volume. It's in milliliters, right? Not millimeters of mercury. Millimeters of mercury, to my knowledge, is not a unit of volume. So we got 120 milliliters minus 50 milliliters, which means that the stroke volume is EDV minus ESV. No? Yes? Maybe so? So we're going to say that our textbook value for stroke volume is 70 milliliters per beat, or you could say 70 milliliters per cardiac cycle. Here I'm going to write 70 milliliters per beat, just so we've got units so we can cancel out. So now I need you to tell me, what's the normal cardiac output? It's Los Angeles.
4,900 milliliters per minute.
That's right, very good. So that's exactly right. So a normal cardiac output beginning tonight, your textbook value for cardiac output is 5,000 milliliters of blood per minute. So that's our textbook value. How did I get 5,000? I simply took the 4,900 milliliters of blood per minute that she mentioned, which is exactly right, and I rounded up, just to make it simple. So you can read most textbooks on physiology, and they will have stated there that a typical standard value for cardiac output is 5,000 milliliters of blood per minute. So now we're coming back to our 5-step model. I'm down at the bottom of the model. So here's the arterial side, here's the venous side, here's all the cells of the body. And we now know through this simple exercise that there is 5,000 milliliters of blood per minute that is flowing to the cells of the body. And if there is 5,000 milliliters of blood flowing towards the cells of the body per minute, there must also be 5,000 milliliters of blood per minute flowing back to the heart. But that doesn't tell us how much oxygen is being delivered to the cells. Right now, all we know is how much blood is flowing to the cells. But we don't know how much oxygen is being delivered to the cells. And to figure out how much oxygen is delivered to the cells, what else do we need to know? Miss Guadalupe. Oh, the answers are all in that 5-step model. Miss Miriam, what do we need to know? Something else we need to know. Well, the saturation hemoglobin would be part of the correct answer, but not the correct answer. Yes. We need to know the O2 content of blood. That's exactly right. Very good. How do we know that? Because in our 5-step model, under gas transport, there were 2 primary factors. One, there's cardiac output, which simply tells us the volume of blood per minute that's being pumped out by the heart. But it doesn't tell us anything about the oxygen content of that blood. So we need to know the oxygen content of the blood. Ms. Gordon, how am I going to calculate the oxygen content of blood? Do you know any famous equations that you may have learned along the way? Ms. Daria, can you help me out?
There's a formula.
Yeah.
So we need the hemoglobin concentration.
The O2 content of the blood is equal to
Concentration of hemoglobin
the concentration of hemoglobin
multiplied by the percent of saturation of hemoglobin
the percent saturation of hemoglobin
and multiplied by O2 binding constant.
the O2 binding say that again. Hemoglobin. HG. Hemoglobin. There. Are you happy now? She's happy. Anybody else in here happy with that? Oh, there's something else wrong up there. Yeah, there is. Okay. So the oxygen content. So I'm just going to use the values I've given you previously, and we'll use male values just to make the calculations easier. So a normal value for the concentration of hemoglobin, which you need to know for test number 4. So if you haven't done this, here's what you need to do. You should have your drug list. You should have a list of abbreviations. You need to have a list of normal values. What's a normal value for EDV? What's a normal value for ESV? What's a normal value for heart rate? What's a normal value for glucose, blood glucose levels? What's a normal systolic blood pressure? What's a normal ion concentration for sodium, potassium, chloride, calcium? Think about all the values that we talked about over the course of the semester. Those all need to be in there. What's the normal value for the partial pressure of alveolar O2? What's the normal value for the partial pressure of arterial O2 and CO2? Create this list. Memorize those. Because on test 4, you're going to have Mrs. Jones. She's going to show up. There's going to be something wrong with her. I'm not going to tell you what's wrong with her. That's your job to figure that out. Okay? So the oxygen content of blood. The concentration of hemoglobin, our normal value is 15 grams of hemoglobin per 100 milliliters of blood. Times, we'll say a percent saturation hemoglobin of about 97% or 0.97. How would we figure this out? We would need to know what's the partial pressure of arterial O2, and then you would take a look at an O2 dissociation curve so you can figure all this stuff out. Don't be surprised. It's all going to be there on the next step. Times the O2 binding constant. Ms. Fung, what is a normal O2 binding constant? Good, that's exactly right. So it's 1.3 milliliters of O2 per 1 gram of hemoglobin. We cancel out our units of grams of hemoglobin, we do the calculations, and we end up with a value that's approximately 20 milliliters of O2 per 100 milliliters of blood. So now what we're going to do is we're going to take these two formulas and we're going to put them together. And in doing that, it's going to allow us to calculate the rate of O2 delivery, of oxygen delivery to the cells. So we're going to write oxygen delivery rate is equal to, and we'll just start off with cardiac output. And we'll write heart rate times stroke volume. So there's the cardiac output part of our equation. But now we need to put in the oxygen content part of our equation times the concentration of hemoglobin times the percent saturation of hemoglobin. Make sure that you understand that you're not going to write that as a percentage value, writing that as a decimal. So if it's 97% saturated, you're not writing 97%, you're writing 0.97. Please don't make that mistake. Times our O2 binding constant for hemoglobin. And so now we simply come along and we take the values that we've just discussed and we plug them in here. So we've got 70 beats per minute times the stroke volume of 70 milliliters per beat times our concentration of hemoglobin, which is 15 grams of hemoglobin per 100 milliliters of blood, times the percent saturation of hemoglobin, written as a decimal, so we'll put 0.97, times the O2 binding constant, which we'll read as 1.3 milliliters of O2 per 1 gram of hemoglobin. Okay, I'll give you guys a couple minutes to do that calculation. Okay, time's up. Miss Nicole.
Around 930
930 millimeters
millimeters of mercury per minute.
of mercury per minute.
Milliliters of oxygen.
I keep saying that, I keep getting millimeters or mercury and hemoglobin mixed up. So your answer is, you said 930 milliliters of oxygen per minute. Yeah, that's in the right ballpark. How many of you got that answer? Good. Okay, excellent. So over here, we're going to come along. Keyword, delivery, what we're bringing to the cell. Except I'm going to change your answer, Nicole. I'm not going to write 930, I'm going to make it 1,000, just to make the math easy for us. So here I'm going to write approximately 1,000 milliliters of O2 per minute. Over here, on this side of the equation, on the venous side, we're going to write the rate of O2 return. And now I need you to think about how you're going to figure that out. The answer should be obvious to you. So you guys talk amongst yourselves, and the question I'm asking is, you now figured out what's the rate at which the heart is delivering oxygen to the cells of the body, but now we need to also use some additional information you've learned along the way to figure out what's the rate at which oxygen is coming back to the heart.
The percent saturation will change. You can just plug in the different percent. What's the percent? Is that 40? Or you can okay, yeah, so it would be like what, approximately 600 then? 11%.
The O2 dissociation curve, but the pressure on less than equivalent back to the blood. So you would have to go 40 on this curve and then find the amount of oxygen there.
The rest of 600? I guessed.
What are the values? 40%? The value of 40 is 65% saturation. Yeah, that's the only thing that's that percent saturation category. So instead of like 70, you're using like quite a bit
Okay, Kyle Tran.
Yeah.
So what's your answer?
600 milliliters of O2 per minute.
Okay, how'd you get that?
We changed the PO2 when returning venously is about 65-ish, and so we went to the O2 dissociation curve. I'm sorry, the pressure is 40, and so when we go to the curve, it's 65-ish, and then we plug that in.
65 what?
Percent.
That's exactly right. Very good. So you calculate the rate of oxygen return to be what?
600 milliliters of oxygen per minute.
Okay. So we'll stick with that. And so over here, I'm going to simply write 600 milliliters of O2 per minute. Here's the next question. What is the rate at which the cells of your body are using oxygen? The question is, what is the rate at which the cells of your body are consuming oxygen? Yes, sir.
When you just get the percent saturation of the rate delivered and subtract the percent saturation of the return to get the percent saturation consumed.
Is that going to be the rate of oxygen consumed in milliliters of O2 per minute?
Yeah, so it'd be 0.97 minus 65 would be, what is that, like 32%, so...
So 32%, and my question back to him was, is that going to be the rate of oxygen consumed in milliliters of oxygen per minute?
So it would be about 4,000 milliliters of O2 per minute.
How'd you get that?
I'm sorry, I meant 4,000, I meant 400, I mean. Sorry, 400 milliliters.
How'd you get that?
By equating what the percent saturation remainder is from when the oxygen carrying the blood away from the cells.
Are you saying no, or are you just scratching your
I'm
nose?
scratching my nose.
Well, your logic is, it's okay,
Hmm.
but it's not the simplest approach. Anybody would help him out? Yes. Okay, she said to subtract the rate of return from the rate of delivery.
Hmm.
And that difference has to be the rate at which the cells of the body are consuming oxygen. So here we're going to write a new formula. And this formula is going to say the following. It's going to say that V dot O2, and this is the rate of oxygen consumption is equal to cardiac output times, and Peter was in the right direction, so we've got 600 milliliters of O2 per minute coming back, but what's the oxygen content on the venous side? What's the oxygen content on that venous side? And the answer is, it's approximately 13 and a half. So the O2 content is equal to approximately 13.5 milliliters of O2 per 100 mLs. Here's why I'm writing that. So our formula says that the rate of oxygen consumption is equal to cardiac output times the arterial venous O2 difference. And that's known as the Fick equation. Fick equation, Fick principle. So here's cardiac output, all of you had calculated that. The arterial oxygen content is right here. 20 milliliters of oxygen per 100 mLs of blood. Here's the venous oxygen content, 13.5. Take that delta. And that delta has to be the rate of oxygen consumption. So here's an interesting thing. You can rewrite that equation. If you know the rate of oxygen consumption, and you know the arterial oxygen content and the venous oxygen content, that you can calculate or determine cardiac output. Okay, now, that's it for tonight. I will be posting a short homework assignment on calculating the oxygen consumption under different conditions, and it will revolve around you using some way the Fick principle to calculate oxygen consumption. Okay? That way it'll help familiarize you with how to do that. It'll be practice. So that's it for tonight. I'll see you guys back here Wednesday night, 5:30 sharp. Those of you that, we'll see you upstairs.